Hello, welcome to another episode of Self-Wired. Today I'll be going over part 2 of Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. If you haven't already checked out my part 1 analysis, I went over System 1 and System 2 in general, as well as some key concepts that will be included in this part as well. So if you haven't already, go check that out. Get up to date on what the two modes of thinking are, namely thinking fast and thinking slow. Obviously, today this will be kind of a short introduction to statistics in general, as well as our inability to use statistics as well as would be necessary to get an unbiased approach to what reality really looks like when we move away from our biases, our stereotypes, all these things that System 1 is really good at that aren't necessarily helpful in gaining an understanding of the causes of events. What we're going to be seeing is, in terms of these causes, is that we see causes when they're not necessarily there. We have an inability to see random events as truly random. It's some pretty interesting stuff. So I'll get into how Kahneman kind of lays out this chapter in terms of an introduction to sample sizes. So he starts off chapter whatever, the first chapter of part 2, with a easy to comprehend example of what a sample is. So say you have a jar of marbles, right? Half the marbles are white, half the marbles are red. Your task is to choose random marbles and try to get all of one color, okay? So let's say you chose 4 marbles at random, right? You're done with the task when all 4 of the marbles that you choose are white, okay? You're gonna fairly quickly, depending on how patient you are, you're gonna fairly quickly get all 4 white marbles, right? But let's say we bump the number of random samples up to 7. How long will it take to get all 7 marbles white? Much longer, right? So what this tells us is smaller samples yield more extreme results. It's a very important aspect of statistics, of running studies, and of the world in general once you begin to extrapolate this out to understand everyday experiences. So here's another example. We've got a poll of random voters, 1,002 registered voters, right? So 57% say insiders with money and power are what the political system works for, okay? What we don't necessarily understand, especially if we're not in the field of research, we don't necessarily understand if 1,002 is an adequately large sample size, right? And what some studies illuminate is that if this was 500 voters, or let's say 2,000 voters, our understanding of how accurate that statement is doesn't necessarily change. We're not very sensitive to how important sample sizes are, right? And this maps onto our understanding of System 1 and System 2 in a pretty interesting way, right? What we see from this is that our System 1 kind of believes that it can extrapolate and use a small aspect of reality, and it thinks that it can apply that to the whole. And this isn't necessarily true. This is where stereotypes come from. This is how the halo effect tends to work its way into our understanding and our interactions with people. It's kind of why people say that first impressions are so important, for an example. If you have a bad first impression, it's kind of the opposite of the halo effect, right? It kind of gives you horns, right? So someone goes, oh, I understand this person completely because, the first time we spoke, they were in a bad mood. That person's angry all the time. Not accurate, right? People are way too complicated to be able to predict behavior that easily. They might have a good day, they might have a bad day, but that initial impression sticks with them, right? So what we're seeing is, in the same way that this 1002 person poll is extrapolated onto the entirety of the United States, your initial impression on someone is extrapolated onto further behavior. It's hard to overcome that hurdle. If that's kind of hazy, it'll become more apparent. That analysis will become more apparent as I move on. Excuse me. So, seeing random events as causality. All right, so I'm going to give a few examples of this. So World War II, London was getting bombed, right? What citizens and individuals in the military that were exposed to this event thought was that this event wasn't random. It didn't appear to be random because there were sections of London that never got hit with bombs. So people went, okay, so there's sections of London that aren't getting hit. That must be intentional. Why would that be intentional? Well, maybe there are spies in that area of unbombed London that they're avoiding hitting with bombs. Obviously, you don't want to kill your own spies. That was until someone came in and went, no, you guys are bad at seeing random events. This event is random. There's no rhyme or reason to where these bombs are being dropped. They're just dropping bombs. So, this is even in a high stakes scenario like a war, obviously. You want to have some kind of explanation for an event. It doesn't matter what section of the event you're looking at. We want to live in a world where there is coherence, where events aren't just chalked up to randomness. That's terrifying, the idea that we can't explain an event. You see this all over the place. Sticking to the idea of war, Kahneman was working with the Israeli Air Force. And on one of the missions, some of these fighter pilots went out in 2 squadrons. One of the squadrons came away untouched. The other lost 4 pilots. So Kahneman was speaking with these officials who were trying to understand, where did this squadron that was impacted so heavily, where did they go wrong? Okay. And so they're analyzing their training, they're analyzing what possible differences there are. They don't want this event to recur. So Kahneman took a look at this and went like, hold on, are we so sure that there is causality here, or is this a random event? Maybe it wouldn't be necessarily beneficial to take this squadron that lost some of their comrades and say, you screwed up in this way, this way, and this way, because those examples you give might not be accurate. Maybe they just were unlucky. So we see this a lot in terms of professional sports. That's kind of an analogy that Kahneman uses throughout part 2. Let's say, there's a golf tournament, the average score of which is 72. Then someone comes out and scores 62. And they go, wow, he had a great game. What did he do? Is there a reason? Like, is he better than everyone else? You might initially assume that initial score that is far better than the average can be chalked up to that player's skill set, and then an announcer, depending on their own predisposition, might attempt to make an analysis of future games. They could either say, he's going to be coming in with so much confidence, I bet he'll even do better than that initial score of 62. And then the player scores 77, which is worse than the average of everyone else he or she is competing against. Then the announcer might go, oh, he choked, right? But what we're seeing here, and what I'm going to get into more later on, is in fact a regression towards the mean. When you're playing at a level as high as some of these professional athletes are playing, there's kind of a mean score that they're going to all fall around. You might get lucky and drop far above or below that mean, depending on the sport. in terms of your score, or you might do far worse, but you're always going to be in a few standard deviations of that mean. And if you do better or worse, if you're playing at that high level, you're going to continue to gravitate towards that mean. That's what an average is. So another example of this is this almost universal understanding of, in basketball, someone getting a hot hand, right? So that they score, like one 3-pointer and then another and another and another. They just keep scoring, right? And they go, like, oh, this guy's in the zone. What you're seeing is, in fact, a random event. But what random means is occasionally there's really good outcomes, right? But whether or not you can chalk that up to something as easily explained as getting in the zone, or if you can simply chalk that up to what a random event might look like, isn't necessarily understood fully by the layman, right? Eventually that person is going to regress back and their hot hand is going to cool off, if you will. And what we're seeing there is random events. Another example of this is in a hospital. If you were to, the outcome of birth isn't necessarily something that has causality. And so if a layman is looking at, let's say, the sexes of 5 babies that are birthed in an hour at a hospital, they might expect that to look something like boy, boy, girl, boy, boy, girl, or girl, boy, girl, girl, boy, something that appears to be random. What they wouldn't assume is all 5 boys in that span of an hour, because that doesn't look random. We want to think that randomness looks random. We don't want to assume that something that doesn't have causality appears to have a pattern. That's not the way our brain works. We want to assume that if there is a pattern, it has a cause. However, randomness doesn't necessarily take our understanding of what it looks like into account. It's not nicely random. Sometimes there are apparent patterns. Those patterns don't necessarily indicate causality, however. So we're going to move on to something called anchoring. And this is closely correlated with part 1's analysis of priming. It's a little bit more interesting, however. As interesting as priming was, this will kind of mess with your head in terms of how random and how obsolete numbers will impact you in day-to-day life. There's some pretty interesting studies that Kahneman conducted himself. So what they did was they rigged this wheel. So you see 10 and 65 on this picture. It was going to stop on either 10 or 65, but all those other slots had numbers too. So this person thinks like, oh, I'm going to get a random number, but it was fixed just for the means of the experiment that I will get into. So the participants landed on either 10 or 65 every time. And then they were asked, is the percentage of African nations among UN members larger or smaller than the number you just wrote? So obviously the participants know this number that I just got of 10 or 65 doesn't apply to UN members in any way, shape, or form. But their brain said something very different, okay? So they would either say, less or more, whatever. They were next asked, what is your best guess of the percentage of African nations in the UN? So the people that got the number 10 said 25%. The people that got 65 said 45%. So what is this telling us? They were unconsciously impacted by the number that they got, right? So why is that? Well, if you asked them, were you impacted by the number 10 or 65? They would say, no, that was a random number I got. That's just, that's not correlated to my interpretation of UN members whatsoever. But that's not what happened at all. they were impacted by that random number because their system one saw it. The system one was asked to see causality, and so system one saw causality. System two then used that information that was given by system one. Again, what you see is all there is. So you were seeing 10 or 65, that's all there is. I'm going to use 10 or 65 to guess the number. You know, unless you know the random fact of what percentage of UN members are what was it, African nations, you're going to give your best guess. However, that best guess, for reasons that I'll be getting into, is influenced by the random number that was initially given. So you see this, strangely enough, in terms of something like real estate agents, right? So there's an asking range on a house, okay? And so, you know, the people that conducted this specific study know that asking price, but then they lowball that asking price and pretend as though that's the initial asking price. Then they ask that real estate agent to give their own asking price. You know, these are people whose their whole job is to understand asking prices. You would think they would be able to get closer to the actual asking price than someone like a business school kid who has no understanding of real estate or what the asking price of a house would be. What they found, however, was that the real estate agents were incredibly susceptible to this initial asking price, even though it was flawed, okay? There's a difference between, I believe, like 8%. So, you know, another example of this that would be closer to the idea of priming was participants in another study were asked, was Gandhi 145 or 35 when he died? So both of these numbers, obviously he's not 145. He's most likely not 35 when he died. These are extreme examples. However, when they were then asked, so, you know, was he 145? The answer would be no. So how old was he? The participants who were given the example of 145 guessed his death to be higher. The participants who were asked if he was 35 when he died gave an estimate of his life that was lower. So what Kahneman says about this is system one understands sentences by trying to make them true. And the selective activation of compatible thoughts produces a family of systematic errors that makes us gullible and prone to believe too strongly whatever we believe. Another just cool study that they did that I really like is they gave, you know, Campbell's soup is having a sale, or let's say like 10% off each can. They put a sign up that says limit of 12 per person. And then they count the amount of cans of soup that people tend to buy. Another day they say there's no limit. You can have as many, the sign actually says this, there's no limit, you can have as many cans as you want. People take this into account and bought twice as many soup cans on days when there was a limit than there would have been on days there was no limit. So it's kind of it's something that you can begin to grasp, and just in terms of your own biases, the way that your own brain works. It's like, oh, I can only have 12 cans. I better stock up, because obviously they're putting that there so I don't stock up. You know, I want those cans. That kind of thinking, where these priming and these anchoring ideas infiltrate us on an unconscious level. And if you ask someone, were you influenced by any of these random numbers we give out, they would say, no, of course I wasn't. That was the idea of 145 or 35 didn't come into account. The idea of 10 or 65 wasn't taken into account. However, system one uses this information, and system two uses this as what's called an effect heuristic in terms of taking it into account, right? These, and I'll get into this again in the next slide, of things that come easily to mind are used. If it's easily available in your memory, you're going to use it to impact your next decision, just because of the intuitive and immediate properties of thinking about an instance quickly, right? So availability heuristics, what I was just getting into. If, let's say, there's a plane crash on the news, you're going to be a little bit more afraid to get on a plane next, because in your mind, there's an available instance where that plane crashed. Planes are scary because I have this memory of a plane being scary. Same with a car accident. You know, you drive by a burning car, immediately the highway is much more terrifying because your brain has access to an instance in which cars crash, right? So you can think of this in another example in terms of, you know, celebrities, divorces, and sex scandals. The news loves to grab these and give you examples of them, okay? So because you're so there have been so many instances in which the news has infiltrated your memory and given you examples. The examples come easily, right? So you have this stereotype that might not necessarily be characteristic of celebrity populations in general, okay? So another instance of availability that is a little bit more specific than just news stories that you use and grab from your memory in order to have an analysis of the way the world works, and a stereotype that you can utilize easily is people were asked to give examples in, like, let's say, how many times they used their bike, okay? So it's like, do you use your bike a lot? You know, you might say, yeah, I ride my bike fairly frequently. Okay, give me 15 examples of the last, you know, give me the last 15 times you rode your bike. Or in another group, give me 5 examples of the last time you used your bike. So people who were asked to give 15 examples kind of struggled with this. It was hard to bring forth out of their memory the last 15 times they rode their bike. So they might they take that into account and they go, oh, maybe I don't use my bike that often, because it's harder to come up with 15 examples. The people who were asked to give 5 examples kind of kept that initial thing of, oh yeah, I use my bike frequently. There's 5 examples of the last time I rode my bike. What was interesting, another caveat to the experiments down the road, was participants were asked similar questions. Like, let's say, you know, are you an aggressive person? Give me 15 examples of the last time you were aggressive, rather than, you know, give me 5 times you were aggressive. I don't mean necessarily aggressive in a negative sense, but like, you know, do you stand up for yourself often? You might say, yeah, I stand up for myself whenever I need to. Okay, give me 15 examples of that. People who were struggling to come up with 15 examples of when they stood up for themselves had issues keeping that understanding of themselves being a person who stands up for themselves, because it's harder to come up with 15 examples than it is 5. However, they were given music and told that the music would impact their capacity to bring forth those memories, right? So, you know, this music will make it harder for you to come up with instances in which you stood up for yourself. Those people that had that understanding and had that kind of seed planted in their head, like, oh, it's going to be harder for me to come up with examples, they were less susceptible to changing their beliefs, because they had a reason for why it was so hard to come up with examples, right? So the kind of understanding of this plays out like this. If it's hard for me to come up with examples, there must not be that many examples, right? So that therefore my understanding of myself should change. I might not be someone who stands up for themselves. However, if you are given an instance in which there's a reason for you not being able to come up with those examples, you don't necessarily use that information to change your worldview or your view of yourself, right? So this is this kind of piggybacks off that initial understanding of our view of ourselves and our view of others. So this is a very interesting study. Different forms of this study have kind of come into play throughout the years. So essentially, these people were in booths and they were asked to kind of give a spiel on who they are, their life circumstances, their life history, all this stuff. And there was an actor in the study who shared that when they get nervous, they often have seizures. So this actor is talking and kind of begins to stutter, and then there's like a kind of a cry for help, and then it goes silent, right? And so a lot of us think of ourselves as, like I would help someone out if there was an emergency, okay? The psychology tells us something very different. What they found was only 4 out of the 15 participants went in and helped this person who had a seizure. So these aren't horrible people. It's 15 random run-in-the-mill people. If you ask them beforehand, if someone was having a seizure, would you try to help them? All of them would probably say yes. However, when it came down to it, the majority of them just kind of stood there expecting someone else to help. No one did. Even though it was a actor, if it had been a genuine seizure victim, they wouldn't have run out of their little stall to help that person. They would have just listened to the silence on the end of the intercom and hoped someone else would as well. However, when people were given an explanation of this study, even showed the reactions of the 11 people who didn't help, and then asked to give a prediction on whether themselves or their friends or family would help, they said they kind of pretended like they didn't draw any information away from this study. They said, no, like me and like my closest friends would definitely help that person. We're the kind of people that would help. They don't take into account the statistic that only 4 out of 15 people did help. They can't apply that statistic to changing their perception on themselves. So it's just kind of an interesting analysis. So how do we apply this to the real world? Okay. What we can begin to do if we want to kind of exercise our ability to use system 2 more often than we use system 1 is understanding averages and understanding that because of the definition of an average, we should apply an average to our guesses on the real world, right? We shouldn't assume that we're outliers in terms of our difference between populations. You should assume that you're most likely one of those 11 people that doesn't help, because statistics will show you that you're probably more likely not to help than you are. You should use that average of, I'm most likely average. I'm most likely not someone that would help. And in doing that, you can have a more appropriate understanding of the way that the world works. So although it's hard, we can begin to use our understanding of averages to skew our understanding of how the world works and how we should respond to reality, right? We can begin to take a statistical understanding of the world, take a statistical understanding of sample sizes, take a statistical understanding of base rates, and apply that to system 2. So we can move away from system 1's immediate approach, which would be kind of a stereotypical analysis, right? System 1 as Kahneman goes over again and again, system 1 loves to jump to conclusions. However, system 2 has to come in and pull away from those initial conclusions using a genuine understanding of statistics, a general understanding of averages, a general understanding of, hey, maybe there isn't causality where you're seeing causality. Maybe, as science kind of continues to show us, it's not as clear cut as your initial understanding of it is. So you can use that general jump to a conclusion of system 1 and then kind of step back, use your system 2 to slow down, think about think through things slowly and pull further away from that initial jump to a conclusion. So I hope that you found this interesting. I hope that I did Kahneman's research and analysis a little bit of justice. Please like and subscribe, and comment if you're reading the book along with me. Comment anything that I left out, and this is an opportunity for me to kind of exercise my ability to understanding some of these really complicated ideas. So I'd love any help that I can get. Thanks again for listening. Stay tuned for part 3.